We must start at the very beginning. The Warner Brothers cartoons, the great classic Warner Brothers cartoons of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and into the 60s. And studio was part of Warner Brothers since the 1940s. And Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, and of course, the great directors like Chuck Jones, Freleng, Robert McKimson. And the studio was moving along and going along. By the late 1950s, short subjects were costing a lot more money to make. They weren't returning to the studio the kind of money the studio would want for such things. Television animation was encroaching, limited animation. The way they made cartoons in 1940 was completely different from 1956. Producers came and went. And around 1957, David DePatie was brought in to run and manage the Warner Brothers cartoon studio, I guess, as its producer, as its executive producer. DePatie was the son of a high-ranking Warner Brothers executive, and he was a film editor, and he was working on the lot, and they just basically handed it to him to maintain the studio. And he became friendly with all the animators. He was, as far as I know, basically a very quiet executive who did his job. And one of the things he did there was to help the studio get more into television, to do television commercials, to do industrial films, to manage what was coming up. The Bugs Bunny show on ABC, the half-hour weekly series that was produced by Warner Brothers, using the old cartoons, but also using brand new footage. And so DePatie had to run all of this. Somewhere around 1960, 61 or so, the higher brass called him in and basically said, we're going to be closing this cartoon department down because we just don't need, we have enough product. We have enough of this material. We don't need to do these anymore. The costs are not worth it. And so they basically said, though, what are you working on now? How long will it take to dismantle what we've got? How long will it take to stop everything? And he just had gotten The Incredible Mr. Limpet. They were still making theatrical cartoons, maybe the tail end of the Bugs Bunny show. And he said, well, it's going to take about, a year and a half, roughly, to really be over. Because, well, you got it, but it's over after you finish the things you're working on now. So, he had to go back and eventually had to tell people that we're going to be laying people off and it's going to be over. And he had a year and a half of which to think about what he was going to do and how to continue this.
Then they closed the studio. We all felt, a loss of something when Warner's closed because that was our future. We saw the end of the future, and Chuck went on his own before that. When he saw the end coming, he went on his own. When you spend 30 years in a company, and I see how some of these people feel today, the best part of their life is they spent with that company. And the rest of the years, what do you do with them? How do you start all over again? You're now at an age where you can't be hired. I couldn't learn to do sodas, squirt sodas or anything like that. What would I do? Be a clerk at a market?
What DePatie knew was they had just recently redone their studio on the lot. They were on the Warner Brothers lot. They had all this new equipment, all this space. They had the means to make animation, even though Warner Brothers had no interest in doing it. And he knew this is something he loved and he could continue to do it. So he thought about it and he kind of did some research on the market. There were still more commercials that could be done, industrial films. Who knows what else? Maybe television animation. He thought to himself, I just needed an animator to help me make this real. I can do this. I just need somebody to make this legit. And his best friend at the studio was Freleng. And I know it was, because I know it wasn't Chuck Jones. And Robert McKimson was an able craftsman. He was one of the greatest animators the studio ever had, great designer. He'd always been the third-rank guy there.
It's harder to point to a distinctive McKimson comedy style the way you can point to a distinctive Chuck Jones comedy style or a distinctive Freleng comedy style, but he knew how to take the elements and he knew how to get the job done.
So if you're going to pick amongst those three, and Jones was sort of out of the question, Chuck had his own ideas and went off to his own successes. Freleng was just the guy. He was the senior director. Nobody knew more about making cartoons. And that said, when they closed the door at Warner Brothers, they didn't immediately start DePatie Freleng. They needed some time. DePatie needed some time to work out a deal, figure it out. David DePatie called him up and said, "Frizz, I've got something going. I want you to be my partner on it. Let's figure this out."
I went and joined DePatie. We each put in $3,000, and Jack Warner gave us a place just as we left it.
DePatie used his connections, and they found that they could actually lease the studio, this newly refurbished, well-stocked animation studio that Warner's was now abandoning on the lot, to him for like peanuts. It was some small figure, like $500 a month. I mean, it was some insanely small sweetheart deal that he can continue to have his company work out of the lot and pay the rent using this facility. And now he wanted to do it with Frizz Freleng. And they set up a business, DePatie Freleng, and opened their doors.
Right away, Dave became president. We divided the stock between us, formed a corporation.
Well, Frizz Freleng, when he started DePatie Freleng, basically hired his whole unit and more from Warner Brothers. All the people, Hawley Pratt.
I give Hawley Pratt kudos for taking Frizz Freleng's shorts out of just being ordinary into a higher level, because Hawley Pratt was Frizz Freleng's layout man, and he just made Frizz Freleng's cartoons just the best.
I have a lot of reminiscences. Hawley Pratt was a wonderful man, and he would come by, always sweet. Sometimes he flirted, sometimes he didn't, but he was always wonderful. You never were concerned about having to go to ask him any questions. They're always very helpful. And ink and paint department, when you sat in the ink and paint department, they were a little bit restrictive. They didn't want the girls to be associating with the directors or the animators. You had to sit in ink and paint and just concentrate on painting your scenes. So, but as an animation checker, I had to go and sometimes ask the director stuff, so-and-so did this, is this what you really wanted, or you don't want that, or is this the right background, whatever the question was. So that's how I got to meet Holly and Jerry Shinneke.
He was Frizz Freleng's favorite guy to do all the dancing. Jerry Shinneke was really good at that. He could have, any time there was a dance scene or something, he'd give it to Jerry. Art Davis, another dear friend. I was his assistant.
So Frizz Freleng, all of his great animators, layout people, all came with him over to DePatie Freleng. He also hired people like Robert McKimson, who was a director at Warner's.
Bob McKimson, he's the one that got me into the studio. Years ago, I worked at Dell Publishing Company and doing cartoons. And Chuck McKimson was in charge of us. And he comes in the room one day and he says, "Anyone bowl here?" And I said, "Well, I bowl." He goes, "My brother Bob needs a bowler on his team." Now, before that, I went to MGM, showed my cartoons. They say, "Don't call us," and we wouldn't even phone you. And I'd be depressed. So I couldn't get in the studios. So when I got on Bob McKimson's team, I was always doodling, and he says, "Oh, I like that cartoon. Why don't you come and work for me?" And then that's how I got in the studio, just by drawing a cartoon for Bob McKimson.
David DePatie, when he was an editor at Warner Brothers in the 1950s, before he was involved with the Warner Brothers cartoon unit, worked a lot with Owen Crump. Owen Crump was a documentary filmmaker and a short subjects filmmaker for Warner Brothers under contract, and DePatie was his editor. Owen Crump was also related to a guy named Blake Edwards. And Crump told Edwards, who was looking, he had an idea to do some animated titles for this movie he was making called The Pink Panther. And Crump said, "Well, why don't you talk to DePatie, because I hear he's running things at Warner Brothers Cartoons." By the time Blake Edwards got over to DePatie, he was running things on the Warner Brothers lot under a new studio called DePatie Freleng. And they said, oh, we'd like to do this thing. We'd like to actually have a character. Well, for his Freleng, we did Bugs Bunny. I mean, you know, one of the best designers in the world. And they worked up, I think they say hundreds of designs. They probably worked up a lot of them, probably 50 or 60 designs of this Pink Panther character, which was a throwaway.
Hawley Pratt, they had other people try to design it, and he used Hawley Pratt's design on it as the Pink Panther.
That wasn't really part of the movie. The movie was about this diamond, and they referred to this thing called the Pink Panther. And they basically handed it to the studio to do these animated titles, incorporating, we're going to, you know, go in on a close-up of the diamond, and maybe we see the animated character, and then he could, like, walk us through the titles. And basically that was the instruction. Well, Friz Freleng walked over to Henry Mancini, who he heard was doing the music. He was already contracted. And he said, what do you got for the music? And he goes, because I want to work to it, because that's what Freleng did best. And Mancini said, I don't have the music yet, but he said, well, give me a beat. And he gave him a beat. He went back and he designed this whole title sequence onto this musical beat.
Now, Jerry did the Pink Panther, the little subtle walk. If you watch the Panther, there's a lot of scenes they used it over and over. He's got this little walk with a little skip and hop in his walk, where a normal animator would just have him walking. But he added that little subtlety that made the Panther be cool.
The Pink Panther was, the titles got sometimes better reviews than the movie.
The movie was good and the titles were good, so it was a win-win.
The movie itself was a smash hit and got great reviews, but no one ignored those titles. People thought, the industry thought, this movie's a big, big hit, and it had these animated titles. Suddenly, DePatie Freleng was the #1 title house in Hollywood. And there are dozens of movies in the 1960s that the animation titles are done by DePatie Freleng.
We were getting offers from everybody, jobs from every producer to do titles. They gave us some of their titles to do. We were doing titles.
You know, DePatie Freleng did like I Dream of Jeannie's opening.
I Dream of Jeannie is still on.
They were the king of opening titles in the 1960s. And of course, they continued doing them for Blake Edwards. His next movie, which was a sequel to The Pink Panther, was A Shot in the Dark, which introduced the inspector character that would be all over those titles. Because that didn't really, they didn't think of it as a Pink Panther sequel. It was another movie, you know, except it had the same character, Inspector Clouseau, bumped up, bigger role in this movie. And they did the titles to that, and these movies came out like in the same year or within a year of each other. And the United Artists, who had only stuck its small pinky toe in the idea of doing short subjects, suddenly got the great idea that these would make great cartoons for theaters. This is at a time when cartoons for theaters were shrinking or dying or ending. Suddenly they're going, we want this. Now, they did the first one. They did a first cartoon, pilot cartoon called The Pink Fink. And they submitted it to the Academy Awards. And it won. It won the Oscar for Best Animated Short for that year. So United Artists, so how are we going to make money with shorts? Nobody else is doing it. We do have a killer thing here because we know theaters are going to book these shorts. Hell, we just won the Oscar. They're going to book these shorts. You know, how are we going to make this deal with them? But instead of making a deal for give us 6 shorts this year or 12 shorts, we'll put out 1 a month, which might have been kind of like what you'd normally think they would do. They really thought this through. They called up David DePatie and said, we want to buy 156 shorts from you. Now, ask David DePatie about this, because when I talked to him and he told me that, I couldn't believe it. Why would they do that? That makes no sense. But the more I thought about it and the more I know about it, it does. They were very smart. They were thinking not just of the theatrical releases, which were super successful, but they were thinking ahead to television. How do we actually make money back on these shorts?
When we went into business, and the Pink Panther made a hit. Here, short subjects are back in the theater. You know, I always said, well, we'll loan you $75,000. You open up a studio, and then you pay us back. So we opened up a studio in the Union Bank building. It was the Union Bank building then. The building on Ventura and Sullivan, brand new building. We got the whole 6th floor, and we worked there for about 4 years.
Pretty much the end Warner Brothers studio just became DePatie Freleng. The exceptions to that were the people in Chuck Jones' unit who ended up following Chuck over to MGM and other Chuck Jones productions beyond that. But pretty much the Warner Brothers chronology, if one is really following Warner Brothers and one wonders to themselves, what would Warner Brothers cartoons have been like if the studio didn't close in '62? You need to look no further than what DePatie Freleng made in the 1960s and into the 1970s. That was what Warner Brothers probably would have become, like it or not. They would have become very much what DePatie Freleng was.